So in the next part, we will have Diane, who is the Director of International Development Team of Social Finance UK, to speak to us to give an account of the birth and development of the PFS model and how it has been used to tackle social issues in UK and globally. And she will bring in Tracy, who is the CEO and co-founder of Social Finance, to speak to us in the air through an overseas call. Tracy is now actually in US, and it's like 3 o'clock in the morning, but she is very enthusiastic in joining us. So may I now pass to Diane first.
Thank you.
4984.
That's Tracy trying to dial in. It's a really great pleasure to be here, and I think I speak on behalf of both myself and Tracy, having been natives of Hong Kong, growing up here, that we're really pleased to see this concept finally kind of taking off here and the government being so supportive. I'll give a very quick introduction of myself before I hand over to Tracy to introduce us. My name's Diane Mak. I joined Social Finance UK around 9 years ago. When I joined, we were 3 months away from launching the Peterborough Social Impact Bonds, which is the first impact bond in the world. I have worked on a number of UK PFS projects since then, and around 5 years ago I set up the International Development Team at Social Finance UK, focused on trying to bring PFS approaches and other innovative financing approaches to Africa, South Asia and Middle East. So I'm really pleased to be here. I think I can hear Tracy on the phone. Maybe I'll hand over quickly to Tracy to let her introduce herself, and then I can take back over from the presentation after Tracy presents.
Yeah, we're connecting Tracy. Tracy, can you hear us?
I can hear everyone. Well, I'm excited to be here with all of you. I'm sorry to be dialing in. Just so very quickly on my background, first and foremost, I grew up in Hong Kong. It's my hometown. I left for the States, since being a teenager. Since 8 years ago, I've been the chief executive and co-founder of the social finance entity in the United States. And it's just been an amazing journey over the last 8 years, building the social impact bond field in the United States, but also globally with the global network of social finances around the world. And we're excited to have India and the Netherlands join our global family more recently. So we now have 5 social finance entities in the UK, US, Israel, India, and the Netherlands, and also an expanding network with more sister organizations to join. It's also really exciting to remark on the momentum that we've seen around the world. So as Diane mentioned, since the first Peterborough Social Impact Bond, which was launched in 2010, the market has really embraced this new public-private partnership to address a wide range of social issues. So there are now over 120 deals in 26 countries, mobilizing almost $500 million. The United States market is the largest one in dollar terms, with now 22 deals in the country. I would also like to just quickly, and I know Diane and other panelists will be talking into how the mechanism works, but our experience has been very much about thinking what is most appropriate for the market context and for the particular social challenge in need that we hope this tool could address. So very much kind of a problem first, tool second mentality. And as you peel back the pay for success technology, if you will, and that's the term of art in the United States, there are many nuances to the tool, from what issue area we're trying to address. And over the years, we have worked a lot in the criminal justice arena, a lot in early childhood, increasingly more and more in job training, in workforce development, in health, and homelessness. Those are probably the chief issue areas that we've worked on. And obviously, everyone in the room would appreciate that poverty is multidimensional, and there's a lot of crossover on these issues. But it's not just the issue area that has a lot of nuance to how we think about these issues, but also how do we measure? What data do we rely on? What is the evaluation methodology that we should use to determine whether a project is successful or not? How do you actually price these social outcomes? How do you think about value generated to government, both in terms of savings, and I put that in quotes because it's more of an art than a science to thinking about savings, as well as more general value generated to society, so more intangible benefits that we also think about how to put a price and a dollar value to, almost what I say, monetizing those very important social outcomes. As well as diversity in terms of the partners that we've worked with. So, we're so lucky to have worked with some amazing partners over the years. The World Bank, UBS Optimus Foundation, Google is a big partner of us here in the United States. The large banks, Bank of America, Deutsche Bank, insurance companies like Prudential, and not to also last and not least mention a very important partner in this journey, which has been philanthropy. Foundations, especially in the United States, have played an outsized role to get the field going, to help build the field from scratch. So, Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, et cetera, have really helped use grant capital to cultivate now a very thriving field. So we've learned a lot on this journey, and we've also made our share of mistakes, and we're just really excited to bring our perspective and our lessons to the Hong Kong market. And I might just quickly mention this, since Patricia and I had a quick conversation about a companion movement, if you will, to the social impact bond movement, which is the what we now call the Global Steering Group on Impact Investing. Just a brief history. Sir Ronald Cohen, who is the co-founder of Social Finance in the UK and also my co-founder in the US, also started a really exciting international movement around impact investing. And 5 years ago, we were lucky to convince David Cameron's administration to take on impact investing, and we actually formed a G8 impact investing task force to think about these issues. And obviously, social impact bond is a really exciting innovation in the impact investing arena. And people would recall from history that the G8 quickly turned into G7 when the Russians went through the Crimea incident. At any rate, the G7 task force has now morphed into a much larger international effort. And most recently at our Delhi conference in India, which took place two weeks ago, 22 national advisory boards were formed. 1,000 people from 54 countries showed up in Delhi to talk about impact investing, and almost all of the 22 countries as part of the Global Steering Group are exploring or have implemented social impact bonds. So this is now obviously a thriving global community thinking about the tool. So I wanted to also share that context in case it's of interest.
Thank you so much, Tracy, for
So
sharing.
I'll stop there because there's no fun talking to someone on the phone. But I'll stay on, Diane, while
Thank you so much, Tracy.
while you share further. Yes.
I think Tracy will stay with us for a little bit on the line in case there are any questions at the end for both of us or either of us. But I will go quite quickly through the first couple of slides because Tracy already gave a good summary of who we are, social finance, and the kind of social impact bond movement. But maybe just a couple of things to highlight in terms of the first step on our journey towards coming up with the social impact bond. When we set up social finance in 2007, as Tracy mentioned, we really kind of started off with the conviction that social sector organizations would benefit from more social investment to spur their growth, spur innovation. And then I guess what we found kind of quite early on is that there are some really robust social enterprises that can take on repayable investment, but actually there are not that many who have the management capacity and revenue model who can really pay back these investments on a sustainable basis. And I guess secondly, when we talk to NGOs and social enterprises, some of the key things that they were frustrated about their current grant or government funding were kind of a couple of dimensions. One was that it was often short term, so they found it quite hard to plan programs 4, 5, 6 years in the horizon because the program funding cycle is often 1 or 2 years. Second, they found that a lot of the funding lacked flexibility because the funding was for them to deliver certain inputs, certain activities, and when needs actually change on the ground, they needed to revise their model. Actually, it was quite difficult to then resubmit the proposals, etc., to get that flexibility to adapt their model. And thirdly, I think in terms of the short time horizon, it also meant that there was lack of incentive to actually measure outcomes on a long-term basis, both in terms of the resources available for them to measure these outcomes, but also the time frame available to measure longer-term outcomes of their clients. So what we thought in terms of these early findings was that we really wanted to find a way to adapt the way that funding flows around a social problem to make funding more flexible, more focused on outcomes, and the ability for social enterprises to actually focus on what they're good at doing, i.e. delivering to their clients, rather than having to write proposal after proposal to get funding. And all these thoughts then led to the Peterborough PFS model. So this is really the genesis of how we got there. And Tracy already talked about some of the various social issues that we focus on, but maybe just to highlight a couple that I think are particularly relevant for the Asian or East Asian context. We have, a couple of impact bonds currently in the area of elderly health and well-being running in the UK that has been very successful. It's called the Reconnection Social Impact Bond. So what it really does is to target, around 3,000 elderly people in the UK who are over the age of 50. It offers a befriending service, connecting them to the local community services, generating activities for them. Because what we found is that in terms of the impact on health, the isolation that is experienced by elderly people is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day in terms of the impact on their morbidity and mortality. So we felt that this was a critical issue to address. The second example I'll give is in the area of mental health and employment. So in the UK, we currently have a number of impact bonds focused on bringing individuals with severe mental health issues back into employment. If you survey people with severe mental health issues, so that could include schizophrenia, bipolar, depression, etc., around 90% of them want to go into work. But actually around 30% of them actually have a sustainable job, and even less if you look at the ones with more severe mental health issues. So this program is really targeted at providing both mental health and employment support services to those who want to go back into work. And what we found is that when someone with mental health issues are actually in full-time employment, they're actually really happy, and there are lots of good health outcomes and social outcomes for them. And then the third example that I'll give is around advancing career and technical education. This is a bond that was launched by Social Finance US, and this is really kind of focused around building up the skill set, technical and otherwise, of underrepresented students in the United States to enhance their career pathways and incomes in the future. And I think Tracy already mentioned that this is now a global movement, so I'll skip this slide quickly. I think one thing to reemphasize that Tracy already mentioned is that we always look at the social issue first when we analyze what is the right instrument. It really needs to be the right intervention, right financing model, and we need to do PFS for the right purpose. So these are some of the things in reflection that we thought the PFS approach worked well in terms of the PFS models that we've experienced. First is whether or not the intervention is providing a person-centered support or service. So by that I mean something that is not a cookie cutter approach. Each person needs an adapted, tailor-made service. Some might have more complex needs, some might have less needs. Some might need mental health services, some might need employment services. How do we tailor the delivery approach to make sure that it addresses the specific needs of the individual? And for that, we think that the PFS model, because it allows for adaptation, actually provides quite a good model for that adaptation. Secondly is whether it's a complex problem. Well, if it's a very straightforward issue and we all know exactly what the inputs are to achieving the outcomes and also the sequencing of those inputs, then probably an experimental, innovative approach like PFS is not necessary. The third point is whether you're trying to shift resources towards a more preventative approach. I mean, I think this is one of the drivers when we were looking at the Peterborough social impact bond. We always want to sort of build the fence at the top of the cliff rather than pay for the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, as one of our board members at Social Finance UK says. So, whether or not there's a need to shift resources towards prevention. Of course, if there's a need for risk capital, because in some cases, social delivery organizations might be able to fund everything themselves, in which case we don't need to bring in social investors. And finally, whether or not a new way of partnering with government funders and service delivery organizations can really bring benefit to the clients involved. And I think, alongside these, I think some of these conditions Alvin actually talked about quite comprehensively in his presentation, is whether or not we have a measurable outcome, whether or not we can actually get data in a timely and reliable manner. Sometimes we need to set up new data systems to enable that to happen. It might not come automatically. Can we, more or less attribute the outcomes to the inputs? We will never be able to attribute everything 100% to the program, because there will be other things happening in the market context. But is this an additional service that is really adding something to the market? Is the delivery organization able to adapt in the way that an outcomes-based contract requires it to do so in order to deliver the outcomes to the beneficiaries? Our fund is interested, is government interested, is a priority. If all the other conditions are met, but actually there's no funding on the other side, then we might as well kind of choose another social issue to focus on. However, having said that, there are situations we found that PFS might not work that well. And I think that's the sort of almost a mirror image of the factors I said were key for the success. So first of all, are the outcomes quite certain in terms of the inputs that you put in? Some partners have talked to us about funding social housing using the PFS model, and we've said, well, the inputs are quite certain there. If you put in the money and you build the social housing, then the social housing will be available. So actually, there's no risk transfer that's necessary in that model. I think where we have said actually there might be a PFS approach is if you're providing that housing and you're providing a package of services around that housing for the homeless individuals, so such as substance misuse support, or connecting them to health services, or connecting them to job services, then it becomes an individual-centered approach, and then we might look at a PFS approach. I think the second case where we found less application for PFS is where there's strong government statutory obligations, where the provision is sort of set, it's really in the government's court to deliver. So where we focus generally is where previously there's no statutory support, or the services that are funded by the PFS approach will be complementary to what is already being provided by government. And thirdly, I think this point is already mentioned, if there are a lot of external factors happening, which means it's hard to attribute, then it might not be suitable for PFS. So one example is I was looking at an HIV program in Swaziland, and actually there were a lot of donors operating in the HIV/AIDS area. So actually it would be very difficult to really untangle the effect of our program versus the HIV programs that are implemented by all the other donor agencies. So in that context, we didn't feel that the PFS approach was necessarily the way to go. I'll spend the rest of the time just quickly going through some case studies and the lessons learned from those examples. As Tracy said, we've made a lot of mistakes, but we've also learned a lot. Peterborough, I think we'll start there. I think a lot of you would have heard about Peterborough, but I'll run through this example quite quickly. Why did we pick reoffending? Well, the statistics kind of speak for themselves. So 63% of short sentence offenders in the UK at the time, 2010, when we were looking at the social issue area, reoffended within 1 year of being released from prison. On average, they had 43 previous offenses and had average number of jail terms of 7 times. So clearly something is broken in that model of dealing with reoffenders. Something is not working. And actually when we talk to some of the reoffenders, why are you reoffending 10 days after you got out of prison? They said actually prison gives us a roof over our head. We don't have a home to go to after we come out of prison. There's food. We don't have money, so actually we'll reoffend just to get back into prison. So clearly something is wrong, and it's costing the UK government a lot of money. It's £40,000 per imprisonment of a prisoner. This is a picture of Peterborough Prison. It looks quite nice on the outside, but not that nice on the inside. It's a Category B closed prison, which means it's housing relatively dangerous offenders, but not, your murderers, or, there's still quite a big risk if anyone escapes. And what did we find out? So we raised £5 million from 17 different investors to work with around 3,000 ex-offenders. And these are the results from the first 2 cohorts in terms of some of the operational metrics that we were using to gauge how well the program was doing. And I think what we learned was that we did use data to really kind of improve our operational results. So you can see that from cohort, the first 1,000 people to the second 1,000 people, in terms of how many are met at the gate, how many were engaged in our activities, it all experienced an increase from one to another, and that's because on a day-to-day basis we're analyzing this data and trying to improve our service delivery. I think 2 examples of what we changed in our service delivery, just to give an idea of what I mean when I say service adaptation. So one aspect was that we found out the mental health issues of some of our reoffenders were much more severe than we originally thought, and we hadn't put in an activity around mental health support when we first designed the program. So around 6 to 9 months into the program, we contracted a new service provider to specifically target the mental health issues experienced by our ex-offenders, and then their engagement went up. And then the second example in terms of adaptation is that we found out that a lot of our prisoners were actually Polish speaking. So a lot of them were Eastern European because of the area they were residing in the UK. And they were having trouble accessing a lot of the statutory services because they didn't speak English. So in the end, we put in some translation services to make sure that they could get access to the right services. So these are things that we would not have known from day one of the program. And this is version 2.0, 3.0, 4.0 of our delivery, but the data helped us to adapt. And in the end, over the kind of 6-7 years of the program, we managed to reduce reoffending by 9%. versus the national average, which meant that our 17 investors got all their money back plus a nominal 3% return on their investment. The second example I will go quickly into is young people who are at risk of entering care in the UK. So this was actually the first project I spent a lot of time on when I joined social finance, so quite close to heart. You can see, again, the statistics are not very good for this group. So in terms of 11 to 18-year-olds who are at risk of going into the institutional care system, either residential care or foster care in the UK, their GCSE exam results are 13% in terms of those who are achieving reasonable exam rates compared to 58% in the general population. 27% of them have spent time of offenders in prison have spent time in care. So I almost see this project as one step, further forward than the Peterborough SIP, because we're intervening even earlier on in these young people's lives. And 70% of prostitutes have actually spent time in care as well. So I think all these statistics show us that the state is not a very good parent. So how do we stop them from getting there? Well, we raised money from a number of investors, and we implemented something called multi-systemic therapy, which is a therapeutic approach in parenting support to make sure that these kids can safely remain at home with their parents, and that the parents get the right support to deal with the kind of sometimes antisocial behavior exhibited by the young people. And when we talk to the investors who came into this project and asked them, so what made you come into this impact bond project? There are a number of reasons. I think the overriding reason for them coming in is to really achieve better outcomes for this group of young people. Some of them, not all of them, have funded the area of young people in the past, but not necessarily gotten the outcome that they wanted to achieve from their grant money. So they wanted to test this new approach to see if they can achieve better outcomes, and I think that was the overriding reason. But there are also specific reasons for why other investors came on board. So for some of them, for example, they might have an interest specifically in Essex County Council, where this intervention was based. So there's a community or place-based approach to their funding. It might be that, so for example, for Esme Fairbairn Foundation, they were starting to explore social investment as part of their portfolio of how they do philanthropy. And this was one of the first social investments they did. And after they did this investment, they actually set up a social investment fund that then funded not just PFS, but a ton of other different social investment projects. And then you have others like King Baudouin Foundation is a German foundation, and also a German social investment fund came in. So these European-based funds came in because they wanted to see how the PFS model could help scale evidence-based approaches. So they've got experience grant funding a lot of evidence-based approaches, but they don't know if, in terms of being able to scale those evidence-based approaches, how you maintain the quality and outcomes of those interventions. So for them, it's about testing using this approach to scale those interventions that they know can do well in a certain context. And then finally, you have people like Bridges Ventures and Big Society Capital. Bridges, for them, this was the first PFS investment. And now they've actually set up a dedicated fund in the UK funding only PFS projects. So this was really, again, a toe in the water for them to see if they wanted to expand this asset class in their portfolio. And then what happened afterwards? So we launched this impact bond in Essex in 2012, focusing on one locality in the UK. And in 2017, we actually created a platform which enabled us to scale this across 5 different other areas in London, which incorporated 5 different commissioners, but which meant also that you can share some of the performance management and data collection costs that are inherent in the SIP model. So what we're trying to do here is to use a platform to scale the model and also increase cost efficiency in terms of the model. So I'll end with a couple of reflections of what we've learned so far from all of these projects. I think honestly, when I look at each of the founding principles of why we implemented PFS in the first place, I think most of them did play out in practice. So, in terms of shifting more resources towards prevention, I think we have seen that actually most PFS approaches have been able to, shift towards the preventative end away from the acute end. When we talk to service delivery organizations who worked with us in PFS approaches, they did say that they found it easier to adapt and innovate under PFS than in the traditional grant and government funded models. And that in terms of data and measuring effectiveness, they felt that the rapid feedback in terms of what's working and what's not is helpful for them in terms of improving service delivery. We did manage to mobilize social investment. I'll go on to talk a little bit about some caveats to that statement. And in terms of sustainability, I think it's still quite early days for us to say that we've proven that the model is sustainable in all cases. I think in some cases, definitely, we've seen that we've been able to influence government policy in a way that they direct more resources to a certain social issue or a certain group that has been maybe underfunded. But because policy change takes quite a while, then I think there are still some cases where we're still working to create a sustainable impact from the PFS model. So I think there are promising early signs, but I'd say the results are still to be seen on that front. This is my final slide. I think some more overarching reflections of our experience in the PFS market. I think first of all, readiness of government agencies to try out this approach is probably the most important factor in terms of whether or not PFS is going to succeed in the market or not. And I think in Hong Kong, it's great that the Hong Kong government SIE fund is so keen to sort of support this new way of working, or at least try and see whether this method works. I think it's important to say that PFS does not guarantee better outcomes. It provides a platform for aligning incentives for different partners to come together to cooperate, to really try and incentivize better measurement of results. But nothing can really replace robust analysis of the social issue, really finding the right fit of intervention for the social issue at hand, and finding the right funding mechanism. So I think all of this is still definitely required, and also how rigorously the service delivery organization then ends up delivering the service. So I think this is definitely one of my reflections. I said earlier on the point about mobilizing social investment. I think we've been very successful at mobilizing investment from foundations and very much social first investors. I think Tracy's market in the US have been more successful at mobilizing investors that may be more commercially minded, or even Merrill Lynch marketing our impact bonds to their high net worth clients. But by and large, I think the first investors in these deals are still very much the socially driven investors, because these are still high risk transactions, and if you want to make a quick buck, there are definitely shorter and better ways to do it elsewhere. I think Alvin again mentioned this previously, but I think it's very important to strike the right balance between measurement rigor and the desire for simplicity. I think obviously RCT is the golden kind of benchmark, but in a lot of cases RCT is not appropriate. We need to find something a bit more pragmatic. And in the cases where we are simplifying the measurement or comparison approach, what we really need to do is to make sure that the right safeguards are in place, so that the things like gaming, cherry picking, etc., are not prevalent. So, for example, on the cherry picking point, what we would want to do, if you have a simplified measurement approach, is to make sure you're very clearly defining the eligibility criteria for the cohort so that people are not picking the easiest to reach, but actually reaching those who are most in need of the intervention. Performance management can be one of the most challenging aspects of PFS. So, although our service delivery organizations, after 1, 2, 3 years of working with us on PFS, all say, we've learned a lot. We think there's culture change. We definitely measure results in a more robust way. We're more adaptive. There is definitely a process and journey for getting there. I think at first everyone found it almost cumbersome to have to record data, and it takes a while to really understand what we mean by a day-to-day data analysis and using that data on a real-time basis to really change your program as you go along. So I think it's a process, but hopefully most service delivery organizations, if the leadership, management, and frontline workers are on board, will get there. And finally, I mentioned briefly before, routes to scale will vary quite a lot depending on what market context we're looking at. It could be, in the UK, using a platform approach to scale to different locations. It could be, in the Hong Kong context, some of the approaches might be to use a demonstration pilot to really influence the way government is spending their money and trying to get more funding into underfunded areas. It could be, to actually fund larger, organizations from the very start who have a very robust track record, and that's, some of the PFS projects in the States have, focused on finding very robust organizations with very strong track record and evidence-based approaches to really launch at bigger scale. So different contexts will require different scaling approaches, but I think it's important to think of it early on so that the right resources are dedicated to embedding that scale up whilst the program is running. Otherwise, you're hitting the end of the PFS program, and then you look, how do we actually make the impact sustainable and how do we scale? Then that's a harder process. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much all for listening, and open up the floor to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane and Tracy. So here's the Q&A section. Are there any questions for Diane or Tracy?
Hi, thanks for the presentation. And Tracy, if you're still online and awake, can you just define for me the role of social impact? If it relate to Alvin's presentation and his chart of all the different parties that are required to make a PFS successful, where would you sit in that, and just to help us understand?
Sure, absolutely. Tracy, I don't know if you're still there or heard the question.
I'm still on the line, but I wasn't able to hear the question.
So the question is, how does social finance sit in the kind of map of stakeholders? What role we play in that PFS nexus? Yeah, so I think that our role in various country contexts have varied quite a bit, in quite a significant ways. So in the UK, and Diane, feel free to jump in here, I feel that social finance has both played the role of advising government as well as putting deals together on the other side. In the United States, we've kind of almost even run the spectrum of government, would RFP for an intermediary to put a social impact bond, a pay for success project together. And then we would then work with government to identify the social service provider, think about the measurement and evaluation methodology, help government and partner with them to price the work. And then actually, and this is something that we take very seriously in the marketplace, in the American marketplace, is that once we price the deal, we are committed to raising the impact investment capital to make sure that the project takes off. So of the 8 projects that we've done in the United States, of the 22, we've raised a little over $100 million to fulfill those projects.
So it really, it could be different all over the world. Our Israeli colleagues, for example, have also done different chunks of the supply chain, if you will, in putting a deal together. So again, we go back to what's most appropriate for the development of the market context in that particular country and tailor our work to that marketplace.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, typically, who funds these projects? Who initiates them and manages them? Is it your company, or who does that?
And I think that's a good question. I think the answer is it varies. For some projects, it's our company who initiates it. So I remember in the kind of early days of PFS in the UK, we would be sort of looking at social issue areas where we think prevention is underfunded, and actually go to some of the local authority departments to say, actually, we see that your budget for young people's residential care is quite a large amount and is growing year by year. Are you interested in exploring new ways of reversing that? And often we would be partnering with social delivery organizations who know the community and area well to put together proposals for a government. But sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes it's the outcomes funder who comes to us. So I can think of a number of projects where it would be sort of initiated by the central government departments if they have a certain focus on, for example, getting young people back into work, working with disadvantaged homeless youth, etc. In the UK, for example, they've set up outcomes funds and solicited proposals from the market to say, why don't you bid into this outcomes fund to say how you would design a PFS program to target these outcomes. So it can be through multiple routes, depending on the context.
Who oversees the whole project? That, like your company would do that?
Yeah, so I'd say...
And you get separate funding for that, for your own company?
Yeah, so I guess, I'll repeat this question to Tracy, and she can talk a little bit about the social finance US funding model. In the social finance UK, we typically have a sort of almost a 20-80 split. So 20% of our funding comes from grants to enable us to subsidize innovation. 80% of our funding comes from earned revenue, what we call earned revenue, which is really project-specific consultancy work to put together deals. And the funding source for the earned revenue can come from either the commissioner, the outcomes funders who want to put together this project, or it could sometimes come from philanthropists or investors who are particularly interested in a social issue area.
Yeah, I think in the United States, we had to build, again, an entire ecosystem from scratch. 8 years ago, none of this existed. So a lot of market education, we do a fair bit of writing and running around, working with policymakers, working with the investment community, working with the social sector organizations. So the first 3 years of our existence in the United States were completely grant funded because it took a while to get the field going. And then, of course, in the last 5 or 6 years, when we do more and more projects, we're able to, as Diane mentioned, earn revenue. But we are still at 2/3 of, earning our keep, keeping the lights on, if you will. So 1/3 of our budget is still relying on philanthropy, and that's why having foundation partnership has been critical for the development of the U.S. market.
Thank you, Diane and Tracy.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you. And I think it's about time
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.